This is Update One, the podcast of the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. Update One provides a forum for listeners to learn about national and international stories, focusing on journalism and communication issues, news, and politics. Now, the latest edition of Update One.
I'm Lincoln Smith, and welcome to another edition of Update One. We are joined by Mr. Mark Hamrick, former president of the National Press Club and currently the Washington bureau chief of Bankrate. He's also the senior economic analyst. Mark, thank you very much, sir, for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Lincoln.
It's really great. We're going to talk about a whole bunch of items this afternoon, to include your career. It's been 25 years. You served as a business editor, anchor, reporter, and producer for the Associated Press. Can you expand on your career?
Sure. My dad was a newspaper editor. He also worked for the AP for 11 years. When I was a young teenager, growing up in Kansas, where he was the newspaper editor, he gave me a choice one summer. He said I could either get a job picking peaches or throwing newspapers. And instead, I started hanging out at the radio station. And, here to this day, we're speaking in front of a microphone. So I had the pleasure of working for AP mostly as the platoon leader for business news for broadcast for more than 2 decades. And I've had the pleasure of working for the personal finance website bankrate.com for nearly the last 7.
What's your focus at Bankrate, Mark?
First of all, as the name implies, it begins with rates of all kinds. So rates for things like certificates of deposit, for mortgages, auto rates, and we collect those rates all across the country, across all these product categories, and that began before the Internet started. It just so happens, however, that the Internet provided a much more efficient medium to help people learn about the rates that they may be seeking, whether it's for saving or borrowing. And we have lots of great free content on the site. It's really intended to help people achieve their financial goals.
Can you expand a little bit, Mark, on the technique, the survey technique that Bankrate utilizes to compare mortgage rates, interest rates, CD rates?
Yeah. Well, in terms of how the sausage is made, that is really the domain of the individuals that do that work, and they're very good at that. And part of it is sort of electronic, and part of it involves humans. And key to that is testing the rate data that we get to make sure that it's verified or accurate. But the most important thing, I think, for people listening is Bankrate provides free information on all of the kinds of rates, whether it's credit cards, auto loans, mortgages, savings, that they might be seeking. And there's really no cost to find out that information. And along the way, our terrific editorial team reports on all kinds of interesting information that is of interest to people as they go about their daily financial lives. So one of the things that I do, for example, is conduct surveys. I'm just completing one of economists. We earlier completed one of what we call market mavens or financial markets professionals. On that, we were seeking sort of their opinion about the outlook for financial markets. And then we're polling the public on a regular basis. And I, along with my colleague and boss, Greg McBride, work on those surveys. And so, for example, they may be on something, for example, to ask people how they're doing with their personal finances, whether they are, for example, living paycheck to paycheck, how they view the outlook for their own personal finances. So there's all kinds of very useful information on the site. And one of the fun things about my job is I get to work with our friends in the news media, whether it's talking to people who are writing for print or online text, on radio stations and radio networks and TV stations and TV networks. And so I'm out and about talking to friends in journalism all the time. So between that and the fact that I was press club president, I was president of the leading association of business and financial journalists called SABU up until earlier this year. That was a 2-year term. And then my Bankrate job, I'm in high cotton, so to speak, because I get to work with friends in journalism all the time, and that's just a tremendous pleasure for me.
You started out at a station known as KGGF Radio. Mark, what inspired you to enter the broadcast news business?
It's a good question. Well, first of all, it was just I was just being very focused on answering my dad's request that I get a job when I was a teenager. But that really did unleash my deep interest in media. And so, as you know, Link, at a small station like that, this was then a community of 17,000 people on the Kansas-Oklahoma border, a 10,000-watt AM radio station. And those stations, as is the case, they still exist today, you get to do everything in the station. And so even at the ripe young age of 16, I would do newscasts, I would be a radio announcer, what we then called playing records, all those things. And then I went to the University of Kansas, studied broadcast news, got to continue to work in the profession then as a news anchor, and then eventually Buffalo, New York for 4 years, radio and TV there. I did some helicopter traffic reports along the way. I met my wife and then was hired by the AP in Dallas, and that began my 26 years with AP.
As someone who's been in the broadcast news business for just about all his life, what changes have you observed in the business? And have these changes been for the better or not, or both?
Well, it's a mixed bag. First of all, when I was growing up, and we're now talking about essentially, a coming of age in the 1970s, you still had a fair amount of, I would say, individual or family ownership of media. And in the years since then, it has become more of a corporate game, and that has been sometimes good for shareholders, maybe not always so good for either the communities those entities are serving. Think about the sort of consolidation in newspaper ownership, as well as radio and TV. Where back in the day, you literally had a station or a newspaper owner who lived in the community and wasn't only doing it for the money. And so I think that we have lost something as this became very often a shareholder-driven pursuit. There are plenty of entities that are not publicly traded, or essentially, where the shareholder focus is the primary concern. But I would say that consolidation and the change in the ownership structure has been largely a negative, but obviously, as I said, good for shareholders in some cases. The other part, of course, has been the emergence of the Internet, the fact that back in the day, what allowed someone to get into media distribution was ownership of a printing press or ownership of a broadcast tower. And these days, what is required for distribution is ownership of a cell phone or personal computer. And so in that way, obviously, you can have this megaphone by simply going to the social media sites, and that has obviously caused tremendous disruption in the industry and further consolidation. And as we know, those who perhaps have nefarious intentions can distribute information and misinformation or disinformation, and that's obviously been a huge challenge for the legacy media industry, as not only has it faced tremendous competition, but obviously we've seen many newspapers essentially stop publishing. We see fewer radio stations doing news, and more people are getting their information over the web or via their mobile devices, and so that's been a tremendous change in the environment over these many years.
Mark, with all of these tremendous changes today in 2019 over to press freedom, is there less, more, or about the same as far as quantity and quality of press freedom in the United States than in previous decades?
I think there are a number of different ways to answer the question, which are not necessarily all arriving at the same destination. And so if you look at, for example, a press freedom index that's compiled by an organization and a nonprofit called Reporters Without Borders, the U.S. Was most recently ranked as 48th on the list of 180 countries, with Norway at the top of the list and Turkmenistan and North Korea at the bottom. And so we're still in the top tier, but we've slipped a few points in the past couple of years. Part of that was reflecting increased physical peril for journalists in the United States, including the horrendous killing of 5 people at the Annapolis Gazette in 2018. And so they're measuring physical danger as well as things which are a little harder to measure. And so that was a remarkably bad experience where you had 5 individuals killed, 4 of them newspaper staffers and 1 other staffer in the enterprise there. We'll see whether that changes in the coming years. I think, though, while press freedom is under attack throughout the world and in the United States, for consumers of information, this is truly, I would say, a golden age in many ways because there are so many different outlets for information. So, as I say, it's a mixed blessing that the technology has emerged the way it has, and then it's, of course, then challenging and incumbent on all individuals to try to distill what is good information and what is bad information.
Over to the golden age of the media of yesteryear, Mark, and what we have before us today in 2019. Take an aggregate total. Which is your preference? Which one will you take? Which era?
Well, obviously an interesting rhetorical question, given the fact that it's difficult to put those would-be genies back in the bottle. I think I would take the present simply because of the access to information and the potential access to information that people have all around the world. I think the primary challenge from, let's say, a global standpoint is that the same tools that help to enhance distribution of information are also handy tools for authoritarian leaders. And we see, for example, disinformation that is distributed by, as one example, the Chinese during the Hong Kong protests where, among other things, they're sort of blaming the United States and others for those protests when I think it's widely understood that those have been quite organic and coming from the people of Hong Kong themselves. Clearly, as I mentioned earlier, the fact that you do have, for example, the newspaper in my hometown basically went away in Coffeyville, Kansas over the years. The population shrunk by half. As I said, the radio station's still there, but doesn't have the news presence that it did back in the day. I'm sure all those people that were involved with that would rather go back to that point in time. But, I don't know that I win any points by harboring nostalgia, and so I'm going to continue to be optimistic that we'll get to a better place using the tools we have.
Today in 2019, is freedom of information access in the United States better than in previous years? Perhaps not, or is it about the same?
In the United States, it's probably worse, and I think that this has been a slippery slope that when I was press club president in 2011, had plenty of people noting that it was becoming more difficult also under the Obama administration, and that certainly has continued under the Trump administration and is very obvious in the sense of, for example, daily briefings stopping at the White House. You don't have the level of briefings that you used to have at either the Pentagon or the U.S. Department of State, and so those are just very physical or palpable representations of the lack of access. The good news is, though, in terms of for the citizenry, journalists are continuing to be vigilant, and they'll file freedom of information access cases as needed. But I think it's more difficult these days. The irony, of course, is that while the White House daily briefing has stopped, the president himself loves the camera, loves the microphone, and so you'll have on successive days where he does his stop and chat for 20 or 30 minutes minutes in front of the cameras on the way to the helicopter. That's not quite the same as having the access that you'd have to officials through the official briefings, where also you have the department's points of view represented in very robust fashion, where now it's harder to get that access.
Amidst the instant information age of the internet that we have now before us, going over the economy, does economic data provided remain accurate, somewhat accurate, or is it less than accurate?
I think this is a good news story, and it's one that through my SABU presidency, again, the nonprofit association of business and financial journalists, that we've been highlighting in a number of different ways through a First Amendment committee. The good news is that the government agencies, the statistical agencies, are doing a great job, and that has been unfettered by this administration, or I would say any other. There are some challenges there, and we're talking, to sort of translate it, we're talking about data that measures the health of the job market, the health of the economy overall through, for example, GDP or growth, other measures such as home sales, retail sales, and those primarily come from the Labor Department and the Department of Census or the Commerce Department. There's other data released by the Energy Department and USDA, the Ag Department. There are some concerns that there's not sufficient funding for data collection, that they could be doing more. But I think the officials that are running those departments would say, either privately or publicly, that they feel like they're getting the job done. And that's very important, because for all of us as consumers, as workers, as Americans, we need to have a view on the health of the U.S. economy. So that we can make all kinds of decisions. Do we need to be saving more money because we're concerned about something happening in terms of the economic outlook? And for business leaders, they need access to that information as well. So whether it's investors, savers, just everyday Americans, we need access to this information. And I think by and large we do have what we need there.
What do you see as the primary differences between the media of today and, for example, the media of the 1960s?
Well, there are a lot of differences. It was an analog era then, meaning it was largely for newspapers, print. It was for radio over the air. Couldn't have on-demand content as we do today through the streaming services that provide podcasts or access to radio content over mobile devices. And of course, for news, you now have the ability to watch news packages or video clips on social media, as well as doing internet searches. So, the game has really changed dramatically in the way that the consumer of news can consume it or view it or read it. And of course, as we mentioned earlier, the way the business works has changed quite a bit over the years with respect to the publicly traded aspect of the fact that most of the media properties we come in contact with are parts of larger corporate organizations. And then the way the journalism business is run, that's changed dramatically when you think about the way a newsroom looked and felt, and I'd even say smelled 50 years ago, where it was primarily male-dominated. There was some egregious behavior in newsrooms, largely having to do with male chauvinism. Most journalists were not as family-focused then as they are now. There was kind of a rough and tumble, sometimes heavy drinking profession, and I think all that has changed for the better, and thank goodness we now, and in some newsrooms you'll see more women working than men, but I think there's still work to do with diversity overall in the journalism industry.
With all of this said, Mark, what is the one aspect of today's media environment in America that you might change?
One aspect, that's a tough one. If I could just click my fingers today and try to improve the situation overall, I think that there would be more philanthropic funding of journalism enterprises and work. And that would help to overcome the problem of the lack of profitability of news at the local or regional level, where you now have, for example, city governments, in some cases members of Congress, who are basically doing their work uncovered by working journalists. And I would say that this is causing a fundamental problem for our democracy because the First Amendment isn't able to operate the way that I think was intended or at least would be optimal to the extent that there's sufficient oversight of our elected leaders and also just government in general, not just those who are elected officials, because the business has broken somewhat. And so we are seeing some of that. There's a lot of really tremendous innovation going on with nonprofits in journalism. They are operating at local levels as well as national levels, but I think that needs to be more robust, and hopefully it will. Some have even talked about public involvement with respect to getting the federal government involved in trying to help generate some of that funding. I don't know whether that necessarily will happen or not. Of course, at another level, you can think about the public television and radio models that rely on some government funding but are primarily funded by donations from individuals and organizations. So I guess that what I'm saying ultimately is that journalism could use a financial shot in the arm, and that may require other models that aren't only driven by private or public, meaning for-profit ownership.
Mark, over to the younger generation, do you posit that they are able to distinguish between fact and non-fact or not in today's media environment?
I don't think it's just a problem for the young. I think it's a problem for people of all generations. And part of it is that some people are so-called digital natives. These are people who might be, well, whatever you want to define as the year the Internet began. It's people who came of age during that time and essentially know nothing else other than these sort of digital models. But I find that there are problems I see all the time with people of all ages who end up being unwitting participants in helping spread bad information. So, for example, on Twitter, Facebook, et cetera. So I think that's really on everybody, all generations. And as a society, and we've heard more about this in other podcasts that we've done here at the Press Club, we need to do a better job with news literacy, helping citizens to understand how to distill fact from fiction. And as we know, there are plenty of harmful actors in the world these days who are leveraging that ability to spread disinformation. And it's really incumbent upon all of us to help stop that to the degree we can. There's also probably more that needs to be done in the sense of regulation of technology companies, and I think that boat has begun sailing first in Europe, and I think we'll see more of that in the United States as well. And obviously we hope that it doesn't harm distribution of truthful information, and I think that that'll be something to watch.
Over to the National Press Club, Mark. You indeed were the president of the National Press Club in 2011, and at that time you hosted the World Press Freedom Day, and this was in the United States for the first time ever. And it was co-sponsored by the United Nations Foundation and the United States Department of State. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it was one of the great pleasures of my year being Press Club president, and I had the opportunity to basically show up and host that, where a lot of other people were doing the hard work, including our executive director, Bill McCarran, and my predecessor, Alan Burga, who then worked for Bloomberg News. But this was one of the most moving experiences of my presidency, Link, because on that particular day, the Press Club ballroom, which easily seats 250 or 300 people, was filled with people from all over the world. And many of them were journalists who were working at great risk to their families and their own personal security. And let me just give you a brief idea about how important that was. After this prize ceremony, I had people come up to me from places like Pakistan, and I've continued to remain in touch with some of these journalists. And imagine having someone come up to you, Link, and say, I just wanted to introduce myself to you because if something happens to me, I want someone to know who I am. So in other words, so that we could intercede in their behalf. And that's one of the great things that goes on here at the National Press Club and has for many years is advocacy for journalists, not only in the United States, but almost more so around the world through press freedom prizes. And there was a great deal of advocacy in behalf of Jason Rezaian, who was a Washington Post reporter, thank goodness, was freed from his captivity in Iran a few years ago. The club was very vigilant in continuing to advocate for his freedom, and thank goodness he was freed and is back here in Washington now.
Mark, what can individuals do, really American citizens, anybody world, to support and celebrate the First Amendment with respect to freedom of the press?
It's a great question, and thanks for asking it, Link. I think there are several things you can do. One is to try to be try to maintain best practices with respect to sharing information. Try not to share incorrect information. And if you see, for example, something on a social media platform like Facebook, et cetera, try to check it out. Maybe do a Google search to see whether it's actually true before you share it or comment. Because, as we said earlier, the sharing of bad information or disinformation is really a problem in our world right now. So that's number one. Try to be a smart consumer of information. Secondly, subscribe to a newspaper. Whether you're in a small town, a medium-sized community, or in a large one, as we are here in Washington, D.C. A few years ago, I was talking with a member of my extended family who was complaining about the cost of a newspaper subscription. And I said, well, do you think democracy is worth investing in? And as it turned out, he ended up paying for that subscription after we had that conversation. But it's not just a question of supporting the newspaper. It's about supporting the effort that journalists engage in, which is specific investigations of very often governments, the vigilance in monitoring the behavior of governments, particularly those here at home. And the way that we can support that is by paying for a newspaper subscription. And I realize for some people that may be a heavy lift with respect to their personal finances, so we don't want them to do anything that's going to harm their personal finances. Otherwise, I'm treading on ground that infringes upon what we promote at Bankrate.com, which is smart personal financial habits. But for those who can afford it, I'm a big fan of subscribing to a local newspaper.
Mr. Mark Hamrick, Washington Bureau Chief and Senior Economic Analyst, Bankrate. Thank you, sir, for joining us on this edition of Update 1.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Link.
Most welcome.
Update 1 is a production of the National Press Club's Broadcast Podcast Committee. You can comment on this podcast or any episode of Update 1 by sending an email to update1podcast. That's update, the number 1 podcast @gmail.com. Thanks for listening to Update 1.